Hey class, this is Mr. Clark, and these are the video lecture notes for History 17B, Chapter 25. Brother, can you spare a dime? The Great Depression, 1929 to 1932. Next slide. There's the overview of the chapter. The first heading is entitled The Stock Market Crash of 1929. The prosperous decade leading up to the stock market crash of 1929, with easy access to credit and a culture that encouraged speculation and risk-taking, put into place the conditions for the country's fall. Next slide. The stock market, which had been growing for years, began to decline in the summer and early fall of 1929, precipitating a panic that led to a massive stock sell-off in late October. Next slide. In 1 month, the market lost close to 40% of its value. Although only a small percentage of Americans had invested in the stock market, the crash affected everyone. Next slide. Banks lost millions and, in response, foreclosed on businesses and personal loans, which in turn pressured customers to pay back their loans, whether or not they had the cash. Next slide. As the pressure mounted on individuals, the effects of the crash continued to spread. Next slide. The state of the international economy, the inequitable income distribution in the United States, and perhaps most importantly, the contagion effect of panic all played roles in the continued downward spiral of the economy. Next slide. In the immediate aftermath of the crash, the government was confident that the economy would rebound, but several factors led it to worsen instead. Next slide. One significant issue was the integral role of automobiles and construction in American industry. With the crash, there was no money for either auto purchases or major construction projects. Next slide. Affluent Americans considered the deserving poor, that is, those who lost their money due to no fault of their own, to be especially in need of help. Next slide. But at the outset of the Great Depression, there were few social safety nets in place to provide them with the necessary relief. Next slide. While some families retained their wealth and middle-class lifestyle, many more were plunged quite suddenly into poverty and often homelessness. Next slide. The next heading is entitled President Hoover's Response. President Hoover's deeply held philosophy of American individualism, which he maintained despite extraordinary economic circumstances, made him particularly unsuited to deal with the crisis of the Great Depression. Next slide. He greatly resisted government intervention, considering it a path to the downfall of American greatness. And there's a quote by Hoover right there. We were challenged with a peacetime choice between the American system of rugged individualism and a European philosophy diametrically opposed doctrines of paternalism and static socialism. Next slide. His initial response of asking Americans to find their own paths to recovery and seeking voluntary business measures to stimulate the economy did not stem the tide of the Depression. Here's some of his more detailed response to the stock market crash. Ultimately, Hoover did create some federal relief programs, such as the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which sought to boost public confidence in financial institutions by ensuring they would be on solid footing. Next slide. When this measure did little to help impoverished individuals, he signed the Emergency Relief Act, which allowed the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to invest in local public works projects. Next slide. But even this was too little too late. The severe limits on the types of projects funded and the type of workers used meant that most Americans saw no benefit. Next slide. The American public ultimately responded with anger and protest to Hoover's apparent inability to create solutions. Next slide. Protests ranged from factory strikes to farm riots, culminating in the notorious Bonus Army protest in the spring of 1932. Next slide. Hoover called in the military to disrupt the Bonus March protest. The violence of this act was the final blow for Hoover, whose popularity was already at an all-time low. Here's a photograph of efforts to break up the encampment of the Bonus Marchers within earshot of the Capitol building here. Next slide. The next heading is entitled The Depths of the Great Depression. The Great Depression affected huge segments of the American population, 60 million people by one estimate, but certain groups were hit harder than the rest. Next slide. African Americans faced discrimination in finding employment, as white workers sought even low-wage jobs such as house cleaning. Next slide. Southern blacks moved away from their farms as crop prices failed, migrating en masse to northern cities, which had little to offer them. Next slide. Rural Americans were also badly hit. The 8-year drought that began shortly after the stock market crash exacerbated farmers and ranchers' problems. Next slide. The cultivation of greater amounts of acreage in the preceding decades meant that the land was badly overworked, and the drought led to massive and terrible dust storms, creating the region's nickname, the Dust Bowl. Next slide. Some farmers tried to remain and buy up more land as neighbors went broke. Others simply fled their failed farms and moved away, often to large-scale migrant farms found in California. Next slide. Maltreated by Californians who wished to avoid unwanted competition for jobs that these quote-unquote Okies represented, many of the Dust Bowl farmers were left wandering as a result. Next slide. There was very little in the way of public assistance to help the poor. While private charities did what they could, the scale of the problem was too large for them to have any lasting effects. People learned to survive as survive as best they could by sending their children out to beg, sharing clothing, and scrounging wood to feed the furnace. Next slide. Those who could afford it turned to motion pictures for escape. Next slide. Movies and books during the Great Depression reflected the shift in American cultural norms away from the rugged individualism towards a more community-based lifestyle. Next slide. And the final heading of this chapter is entitled Assessing the Hoover Years. In Hoover, Americans got the president they had wanted, at least at first. He was third in the line of free market Republican presidents elected to continue the policies that had served the economy so well. Next slide. But when the stock market crashed in 1929 and the underlying weaknesses in the economy came to the fore, Hoover did not act with clear intentionality and speed. Next slide. His record as president will likely always bear the taint of his unwillingness to push through substantial government aid, but despite that failing, his record is not without minor accomplishments. Next slide. Hoover's international policies, particularly in regard to Latin America, served the country well. Next slide. While his attitude toward civil rights mirrored his conviction that government intervention was a negative force, He did play a key role in changing living conditions for Native Americans. In fact, his vice presidential running mate was a Native American. Next slide. In all, it was his and the country's bad luck that his presidency ultimately required a very different philosophy than the one that had gotten him elected. Next slide. And that's it for chapter 25.